Picture this. A pair of fighters is already airborne. The jets are healthy, the pilots are calm, the radios are clear. There's no fireball, no panic call, no cinematic moment that tells you the mission failed. And yet, they turn back. Not because they were defeated, not because the target moved, not because the plan changed. They turn back because fuel is the only limit that does not negotiate. That is the first misunderstanding about modern air power. People picture air power as a contest of performance, speed, stealth, weapons, sensor range. But the system often fails before any of that gets tested. It fails when presence expires. When aircraft have to leave early, the system doesn't just lose 2 jets over a patch of sky. It loses the ability to decide what happens next. Being shot down is catastrophic, but it is also visible. Visibility forces consequence. It triggers investigation, replacement, political pressure, tactical changes. The system reacts because the loss is undeniable. Turning back creates none of that urgency. It produces a quieter, more corrosive outcome. The system begins adapting to absence. When aircraft return early, commanders stop planning around holding and start planning around visiting. Timelines compress, options narrow. The system becomes conservative, not because the enemy proved superior, but because internal margins shrank. And conservative air power is fragile air power. This is why endurance is strategic. The enemy doesn't need to win a fight. They only need to make your time expensive. The KC-135 matters because it protects the system from learning the habit of leaving early, and that habit is how capability quietly turns into restraint. A sortie is an event. Presence is a condition. Events are easy to count. Takeoff, strike, landing. Conditions are harder. A patrol line that stays stable. A sensor picture that never drops. A decision maker who can wait for confirmation instead of gambling. Modern air operations revolve around those conditions far more than the public narrative admits. Deterrence works through waiting. Tracking works through staying. Crisis control works through having aircraft in place long enough that the situation can't slip through the gap. That is why brief appearances don't scale. A force that shows up, fires once, and leaves can still be lethal, but it cannot shape tempo. It cannot keep pressure on uncertainty until uncertainty becomes information. The KC-135 is not the aircraft that creates the visible effect. It is the aircraft that turns air power into a standing option, a persistent condition the rest of the system can rely on. Without refueling, range is a wall. With refueling, range becomes a schedule. That sounds like wordplay until you feel what it does to planning. Without tankers, the key question is, can the aircraft reach it and return? With tankers, the question becomes, how long can the force hold this space, and how many overlapping timelines can we sustain? That shift turns endurance from an individual aircraft problem into a system management problem. Timing, redundancy, handoff, and resilience. It also changes geometry. Patrol lines can be drawn farther out. Coverage can be maintained with overlap instead of cliff edge handoffs. Mission packages can keep coherence even when something slips because the plan has time to absorb friction. Fighters operate at the edge of capability. Tankers decide whether the edge can be held without breaking. This is why the KC-135 can matter more than a fighter. It doesn't add a sharper spear. It keeps the spear in your hand longer. There is a common intuition that technological progress should reduce dependence. Faster jets, better engines, smarter systems, surely these should make aircraft more self-sufficient. In practice, the opposite tends to happen. As fighters become more advanced, their missions become heavier, not lighter. Modern fighters are not just vehicles. They are hosts for sensors, networks, and coordination tasks that run continuously. Even when nothing is fired, the aircraft is expected to remain connected, track multiple inputs, and stay available for reassignment. That persistent workload consumes endurance. Stealth design also tightens margins. shaping, and internal carriage trade, flexibility for survivability. The result is an aircraft that is extraordinarily capable, but not inclined to leave early. The system expects it to stay. This is where refueling becomes more central over time, not less. Tankers absorb the endurance burden created by progress. They allow advanced aircraft to operate as they are meant to be used, persistently, not episodically. Without that layer, technological advantage collapses into short appearances that cannot be sustained. When refueling capacity is insufficient, the first thing that breaks is not lethality, it is planning depth. Commanders stop designing missions with contingencies because contingencies require time. Overlapping coverage disappears because overlap consumes fuel margin. As margins shrink, behavior changes. Missions become single-threaded. Aircraft are held back just in case. Decision makers act earlier, not because they have better information, but because waiting becomes too expensive. This is the critical insight. Endurance scarcity forces strategic behavior before contact. The system starts thinking smaller, it avoids uncertainty instead of managing it. That shift happens quietly, without losses or headlines, but it shapes outcomes long before weapons are used. The KC-135 prevents this failure worldline by preserving time as a usable resource. It keeps planning flexible, options open, and decisions delayed until they can be informed rather than rushed. That is not a tactical benefit, it is a structural one. In the endurance layer, novelty is not the primary virtue. Predictability is. A tanker is a timing node around which many other timelines synchronize. Crews, packages, command decisions all assume the tanker will be where it is supposed to be when it is supposed to be there. That assumption reduces uncertainty across the system. Reduced uncertainty allows everything else to operate closer to its limits without crossing them. In complex operations, that trust is a form of combat power. This is why aging tanker platforms can remain central even as frontline aircraft evolve rapidly. Their value does not come from pushing the edge of performance, it comes from anchoring the schedule. Reliability is not glamorous, but it is stabilizing. The KC-135 persists not because it is old, but because it is understood. In a system that depends on coordination over time, being understood is often more valuable than being new. The KC-135 is often described as support, which suggests something safely removed from operations. That framing is misleading. The tanker does not sit behind the fight. It sits at the intersection where tempo, risk, and escalation meet. Its availability determines how far forward aircraft can operate, how long patrol lines can be held, and how many simultaneous tasks can be sustained without gaps. These are not background details. They define operational geometry. Endurance abundance allows restraint. Endurance scarcity forces haste. Haste increases error, and error drives escalation. In that sense, the tanker quietly regulates not just air operations, but decision quality. The KC-135 does not need to cross into the most dangerous airspace to shape outcomes. By stabilizing time and space elsewhere, it determines what the rest of the force is even able to attempt. It is tempting to think of tankers as generic fuel trucks in the sky. If fuel is fuel, then any tanker should be able to fill the role. In system terms, this assumption is wrong. A tanker is not just a container, it is a routing structure. Refueling availability determines where aircraft can top off, how often, and with what margin. Those variables shape the entire plan. Dense, reliable refueling enables continuous patrol lines and flexible reassignment. Sparse or uncertain refueling forces episodic presence and conservative routing. This difference is not subtle. It changes whether aircraft can overlap coverage, whether they can wait for confirmation, and whether commanders feel comfortable pushing timelines instead of compressing them. So tanker capacity is not modular. Having some is not the same as having a functioning tanker layer. The system does not ask whether refueling is possible, it asks whether refueling is predictable. The KC-135 matters because it sits inside that predictability layer, turning refueling from an opportunity into an assumed structure. A fighter largely extends itself. A tanker extends many fighters at once. That asymmetry explains why tankers can matter more than individual combat aircraft, even though they rarely attract attention. In system terms, leverage comes from nodes that alter the behavior of multiple other nodes simultaneously. A single tanker affects how long several aircraft can stay, how their rotations overlap, and how many tasks can be sustained in parallel. That multiplication effect is powerful. When tanker availability drops, the loss is not proportional. You do not simply lose one aircraft's endurance, you lose coherence across multiple timelines. Patrol lines break, handoffs become sharp instead of smooth. Decision makers stop trusting the system to hold. The KC-135 functions as a pacing engine. It sets rhythm, and rhythm, steady, repeatable tempo over time, is often more decisive than peak performance displayed briefly. That is why tanker scarcity destabilizes systems faster than most people expect. The KC-135 is underestimated for a structural reason. Humans notice events, systems depend on conditions. Explosions, intercepts, and weapon releases are events. Endurance is a condition. Conditions do not announce themselves, they persist quietly. When the tanker layer works, it disappears. Patrol lines simply exist. Aircraft stay where they are supposed to be. Success is credited to the platform at the front of the frame because that is what people can see. The enabling structure fades into the background as a presumed constant. Only failure reveals it. When tankers are delayed or insufficient, nothing explodes. Coverage evaporates. Aircraft leave early. Plans shrink. The system retreats without admitting defeat. This is why endurance systems rarely receive credit. Their job is to prevent collapse, not to create spectacle. But modern power depends far more on what prevents collapse than on what looks impressive when everything goes right. The old intuition says air power belongs to the aircraft that pulls the trigger. The KC-135 exposes a different reality. Modern air power belongs to the systems that decide how long aircraft can remain usable. Fighters create effects. Tankers create conditions. Conditions determine whether effects can be applied at the right place, at the right time, for long enough to matter. The KC-135 does not dominate the fight. It makes the fight sustainable. Without it, air power does not fail loudly. It fails quietly, by leaving early, shrinking options, and surrendering tempo. That is why the KC-135 matters more than most fighters. Not because it looks powerful, but because without it, power stops showing up when it is needed.